Does the pressure get to you? Do you feel like you have more to give, but you just can't get the most out of yourself? Does anxiety overwhelm you when you show up to the starting line or step onto the field? Have you ever wondered about the yips or choking in sport and why it occurs? Well, guess what? This video is for you because we're going to go deep into the psychology and science and look at some of the research that I found from talking to and working with some of the best performers across sports, from Olympians to NBA athletes to NFL to MLB to everybody in between. We're going to cover it all. So let's start with the story. I'm going to tell you about my 1.5-year-old daughter. She does swimming classes. She's done that since a year old. She just splashes around. They teach them how to hold their breath. And let me tell you, she's a champ in her class. She is the stud. I'm bragging about her. But she can hold her breath for up to 8 seconds underwater and kick on demand. That's really good compared to everyone else. But the other day, we showed up to swimming class and there was a new kid. And with toddlers in swimming class, the parent goes with them. And the new kid brought his dad, who was a bigger guy with a huge beard. And my daughter's so excited for swimming. We say, "Do you want to go to swimming?" She gets so pumped. She's excited. She's smiling and grinning and laughing. We're headed towards the pool. We're all ready to go. We step in. She's giggling, looking at the instructor, ready. And then she sees the bearded man. And in that instant, it was over. For the rest of the 30-minute class, instead of doing the songs and dances and kicking and playing with the rubber duckies in the pool and going underwater, stuff she loves, she just has this death grip on me. And no matter what I try, I can't get her out of this death grip. She is scared, frightened, and in threat mode. Why? Something triggered her with the bearded man. Now, when it comes to performance and choking or underperformance, that's how it works for us too. We have a threat response. So generally when we line up to race or show up to the practice field or the game field, our body prepares. Stress is preparing us for the endeavor we're about to undertake. And it's a good thing, because if we didn't feel stress, we wouldn't be able to get the most out of ourselves. Stress is literally releasing the energy that our muscles need to function. It helps pave that way. But what happens is we have a variety of stress responses. Some can be good. Some can tip over into preventing us from performing. So chances are you've heard of fight or flight, but we have a myriad of them. So it's not just fight or flight. We also have faint. We have, fleeing. We have freezing. We have tend and befriend. We have this, social comfort. We have playing dead. We have a variety of them. And with each twist and turn of our stress response comes a different hormonal and neurological combination. And most importantly, a different behavioral combination. So when it comes to underperformance, often what happens is we get stuck on either freezing or fleeing. Freezing is this shutdown where we just kind of freeze. There's nothing else we can do. We get stuck. Fleeing is where we want to just avoid and run away. We have others where we have a disconnect between what's going on and what we're perceiving. And when it comes to underperformance or choking, our stress response kind of paves the way. The good and bad news is that we have some control over this. We can train ourselves in the right direction. Let's go to the extreme version of this. Not my daughter in the pool, but choking. So choking in sport, often we talk about when athletes get the yips, right? When a pitcher who has performed at a high level and is a professional suddenly loses the ability to toss the ball or throw the ball, 60 feet away or 90 feet away, something that they could do since they were, little. It's the Chuck Knoblauchs of the world, a second baseman for the Yankees, who all of a sudden couldn't throw to first base. Or Rick Ankiel, who during the playoffs went from a stud, rookie to throwing wild pitch after wild pitch and then being stuck with an inability to pitch, the thing he is literally one of the best in the world at. Or it is Simone Biles getting the twisties, where all of a sudden she can't do the things that came naturally. Now, what happens here is a couple things. First, there's that threat response. And in relation to that, we have an extreme reaction, not just freezing for a moment, but what's called a perception-action disconnection. So what we perceive in the world and how we act disalign. You can see this in Biles, right? Normally when she goes up and flips in the air off the vault, she knows exactly where she is. Her body is automatically in tune. So our body has all these sensory apparatus where we know as we're flipping in the air, because she's done it so much, where she is and when the ground is coming. When she got the twisties, that disconnected. She no longer knew where she was. She no longer felt connected to where her muscles were moving in the air and her legs were moving in the air. So what happened? That exacerbated the stress and the threat. And she said, I can't do this. This is a danger because I have no idea. I might hit the ground and hit my head. What happens here is this perception action disconnection is it essentially takes us back to us as a beginner, right? So research in baseball players has found when they lose the ability to throw, or in golfers, we move from a smooth action that is integrated, right? We don't have to think about it. We just know how to do it, to back when we were a beginner where it's segmented. Where if you watch, my toddler learn how to throw a ball, it's segment after segment. It's, I'm going to move the arm back and I'm going to try and toss it forward. You can see this in beginners as they're learning. For whatever reason, this extreme threat response takes us back there. We move from smooth to segmented. We're overthinking something that has become automatic. And when we overthink something that becomes automatic, it all goes wrong. We shouldn't be trying to force that control. Another example to maybe, make this, central or connect with you is to think of going to play the kids game, pin the tail on the donkey. Go spin around a lot, and all of a sudden your perception and action are disconnected, right? Because you're dizzy, what you perceive and where you're trying to pin that tail is off. Even though, if you weren't dizzy, it would be simple. You take the tail and you put it right on the bullseye. But because there's that disconnection, we can't move our body in the way that we want to. The last thing I'll say on this before we get into so what is part of understanding this underperformance or choking is realizing that the brain is predictive. So once it gets in one of these threat responses, it starts predicting it in the future. It says, oh, wait a minute. We're in that situation again. Hit the threat alarm. Go to this freeze response or this flee or avoidance response. We don't even need to prepare. Just hit the button. This is the stress response we're going. And this is why it's so hard to get out of that rut, because our brain connects stepping into the arena or stepping onto stage with use this stress response. We get in this bad predictive rut. So part of it is we have to figure out how to dislodge it. Now, why in the world do we feel this threat response in something that maybe if you're Simone Biles, you're one of the best in the world at? Often it's individual, but often it comes from doing something on the public stage where our sense of self, for whatever reason, is now on the line. What do I mean by that? It means we have this psychological immune system that likes to protect our sense of self. We don't like to see ourselves fail. We don't like to see ourselves embarrassed or humiliated. There's something about the stress of doing it in front of people that activates that fear. Normally we can tamper it down and we're okay. But if it truly feels like our sense of self, whether we perform this routine or make this out or run this PR, determines if we ourselves are a success or a failure. If we are validated as a human being, as a person, or if it becomes, I am a failure from losing this game, the more intertwined our sense of self is with the pursuit, the more threatened we are in a public arena when it seems like things could go wrong. This is why those who suffer, or those who have a higher level of what we call athletic identity, meaning their sense of self and their sport are intertwined like this, they're cemented together, they have a higher chance of experiencing negative pressure and choking. Outside of sport, it's why those with a unidimensional identity have a higher chance of choking or feeling the anxiety as well, because it makes us fragile. So going all in and not seeing the bigger picture, or not having a diversified self, or what researchers call self-complexity, actually increases our risk for choking. Rick Ankiel said as much, and I'm paraphrasing, when he said, I didn't realize that I made baseball the only thing, and that contributed to his downfall. So part of it is realizing and building a diverse sense of self. The other part is our relationship with success or failure. If we see failure as the be-all, end-all, then chances are we're going to go down that path as well. So what I'd like to do next is say, okay, this is the science of the psychology of underperformance or choking. What in the world can we do about it? And I want to be clear, a lot of this comes from, in fact, almost all of it comes from my new book, Win the Inside Game, which just came out. So if you haven't yet, get a copy. You won't regret it. It's going to help you perform at the highest level and deal with underperformance, whether that's sport, business, or life. And I'm going to break down what we can do in this video in terms of in the moment. So when you feel that stress, anxiety, pressure, how can you deal with it? And then also over the long term. So how do we get out of these ruts where our brain jumps straight to threat mode? How do we build a more resilient self? And then the last thing I'll cover is what I call do something crazy, which essentially means like when we're really in the thick of it, how do we escape? All right, so let's start with in the moment. What do you do when you feel that pressure, stress, maybe your perception and action are decoupling? What in the world do you do? So stress tends to narrow us. It makes us think that the thing that we're about to do, the thing that we're going against is the be-all, end-all in the world, okay? Nothing else matters. That's why our mind literally narrows, our brain narrows. If you look at some research by Moshe Bar, a neuroscientist. It's fascinating. What we often need to do is either disrupt that or broaden it, meaning zoom back out or throw a kink into it so that we shift our narrow focus to something more productive. So I'm going to name a couple of things that you can do here. First is you can use what I call a physiological disruptor. One of the ways to do this is you can dunk your head in cold water or splash cold water on your face. Why does this work? We have this thing called the diving reflex, where essentially cold water gets splashed in our face, our heart rate drops quickly, we shift a little bit from sympathetic nervous system to parasympathetic. It calms us down. Why? It's complicated, but it's basically our brain thinks we've fallen into the water and we might drown, so we conserve. We go into conserve oxygen, conserve energy mode. So splashing your face with water can disrupt the physiology and make us broaden out and calm down and be in a better place. This is often why you see people do cold plunges, jump into cold water. I'm convinced that most of the benefit around that, not all, but most of the benefit is making us feel alive and having this calming effect. What do I mean by making us feel alive? Often when we're in this narrow world or we feel numb to the world, our connection from our mind to what we experience or feel in our body, we call this embodiment, is severed. And when we jump into a cold plunge, it makes us feel alive, and we have to pay attention to the cold water or the feeling and sensation, which drives us like internally away from the rumination or numbness and towards something else. We're shifting our attention. Okay. Speaking of attention and focus, I talked about going broad. Well, that can work. So there's some research that shows that if you broaden your vision, such as me taking off my glasses, so now that everything is blurry narrowly, so I have to look broad, that also has a calming effect, because broadening your attention is, again, the opposite of stress tends to narrow and focus us. We broaden it out, our brain kind of calms down and gets out of threat mode a little bit. And you can actually do the opposite. So focus narrowly, but give yourself something better to focus on. So there's research in sport that shows that during moments of when you feel that pressure, such as kicking a free kick in soccer or football, if you narrowly focus externally, it helps you perform better. Why? Essentially, it locks on, it says, I'm going to kick the ball here, right? And your attention gets locked onto it, and it fades away all of the rumination, the catastrophizing, the stress outside of it. It also enhances what we call the quiet eye, which if you look at research in psychology, the moment before you're about to kick that ball or shoot that arrow, if you're archery or something like that, or hit the baseball, the quiet eye is this moment of like stillness and focus where you get locked onto something. And the longer it is, the better we tend to perform under pressure. We can somewhat engineer this by giving ourselves an external focus of attention on something that is important rather than looking for the threat. Other things that work is reframing. So not in the highest sense of the stress or pressure world does this work, but in generally lower or moderate stress, when we start to reframe that stress or anxiety feeling as not anxiety, but excitement, meaning we're prepared to take things on, that helps. Or reframing our goal, or we talked about attention, our focus. So sometimes when we latch on to outcome goals, it gets in the way. So we can start thinking about the process. What are we trying to do? Or shorten our goal into something that is achievable right now. So if you're in the middle of the marathon and you feel overwhelming and everything's going wrong, instead of thinking, oh, I have 10 more miles left, think, I'm just going to get to the next turn. I'm going to get to the next mile mark, and then I'll drop out. Then I'll worry about it. And chances are you get to that next mile, and then you bite off the next little piece to pursue. So shrinking or reframing your goals. And the last thing that I'd say that this all ties in is your self-talk. So generally, when we're in the moment, in the heat, our self-talk turns negative or gets lashed onto distractions. What we need to do is shift that a little bit by creating distance between ourself and our voice. We call this psychological distance. One of the ways to do this is to go from first person to third person, or first or second to third person. So instead of being like, I can't do this, I can't, I'm going to choke, etc., you zoom it out. You say, Steve, or you, they, whatever have you. You zoom it out so it doesn't feel as connected. And also talking out loud to yourself can actually do the same thing, because your brain goes, okay, that's not our internal voice, it's our external. Maybe we should listen to it. So that's in the short term. Over the long term, when we look at choking our underperformance, what it really is about is disrupting that connection to the thing you fear. So I mentioned our brain is predictive. It gets latched on to this prediction of, that's something I'm afraid of. That's something that's a threat. Go negative, or a stress response that isn't good for us. What we need to do is build a robust sense of self where we can take on the challenge, so that instead of threat mode, we default towards that challenge mode, which is accompanied less of the hormone cortisol and more of the hormones testosterone and adrenaline. In the book, I go deep into this, so if you want to learn more, check it out. But I think a couple things that are really helpful here are, first, creating a robust sense of self, meaning Research shows that if we diversify our sense of self, we tend to be more resilient. Why? Because it's not us on the line when we're performing. It's not, oh, Steve didn't run this fast, so therefore Steve is a failure. It's we have a diverse sense of self. So it's not just Steve's a runner, but he's also a writer, a dad, a husband, a creator, a podcaster, someone who is interested in learning and likes reading. I have this complexity around myself. But if I don't see it, I tend to be less resilient. This is why researchers find those with a higher degree of self and social complexity, meaning we see ourselves through a diverse lens and we have a number of places and people and groups that we belong to. We are more resilient, and when we take on threats, the threat alarm only goes up a little bit instead of hitting the panic button. The other thing that really matters when it comes to creating a robust sense of self to handle this underperformance is making sure you have a clear definition of success and what you're trying to get out of the pursuit. Often, success is dictated externally. It's almost like someone tells us what to view success as. We think, we've got to get into X college, or we've got to achieve or win the state championship, or we've got to run this time. It's all external outcomes that are often fed to us. Instead, what we have to realize is that external outcomes to win, to run a certain time, yeah, they're important. I'm not saying you're some Zen monk who thinks like winning doesn't matter. Forget that, okay? It does to a lot of people. Acknowledge that, but you've got to couple that with something internal, something of substance. This is why if you look at the research on status or significance, often when we think of status, we think of our primate cousins, the chimpanzees, apes, whoever reaches to be the quote unquote top of the hierarchy, the top dog. That's a view of status that we call dominance, meaning you gain status by dominating others, by winning against them. You can do that. It has some downsides, but you can do that. But research shows there's other ways to achieve status too. Not only dominance, but what we call prestige and virtue. Prestige is essentially mastery over something. You're pretty good at your hobby, your job, your pursuit. You know a lot about X, Y, and Z. You do well in something meaningful. You have significance. You contribute in something. Virtue is you are a good person, someone who I can trust, someone I value, someone who brings positive aspects not only to themselves, but the community, to friends, to others. You're that person who someone's going to call when they're struggling. All of those give status. And the great thing is that it doesn't matter how we get that status or significance in what we do, or defining our success in a way. It all contributes. It's why the great neurobiologist Robert Sapolsky once said when talking about status, in the workplace, a lot of people think it's tied to your salary or moving up and stuff. But he said when we looked at it, if someone was kind of mediocre at work, but they were the star on the company softball team that played once a year, and everybody said, oh, we got to have Jimmy on the team. He helps us win. Their sense of self, their well-being, their happiness, all of that was just as high as someone who got their status from being really good at work. Meaning we can get our sense of status or even success in multiple different ways. Allow yourself to. And then the third thing that I think is really important is a sense of belonging. So our environment, our team, our coaches, our friends around us literally shift our perspective of what we're capable of and the task before us. So researchers have found that if you're standing in front of a bunch of heavy boxes and you're doing it alone, you will judge it as heavier than if you have a friend or a companion nearby. If you're going over how you messed up in the last game, your hormones will literally change whether you're going over over those places you messed up with a stranger or someone who's adversarial or a friend. With a friend, more testosterone, less cortisol. With a stranger, more cortisol, less testosterone. We shift how we handle challenges and what we think we're capable of and the tasks of the demands are based on if we have connection or friends or belonging nearby. This is why the coach's atmosphere they create is so important. Whenever a coach creates a sense of connection and autonomy and support and security, we perform better. It's what my toddler does, right? When mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, or friends are nearby, she'll go wild and explore the world and be wild and crazy. If none of us are nearby, or she's at the playground and doesn't see us, and it's just strangers, guess what? She freezes. Why? We look to the around us to see, is this a secure environment where I can risk failing and still be loved, supported, etc.? Or should I fear failure? Your environment signals that. We also, research tells us, social baseline theory tells us that we share the load, meaning we literally share our emotional regulation. So if we have support around us, we share it. So think about that as you handle difficult moments. Have that support team. And the last thing in terms of long-term is developing intrinsic motivation in addition to extrinsic is the achievements, the accolades, rewards. Intrinsic is the joy, the exploration, the love of the pursuit. Researchers on Olympians found that those who made it to the top tended to have more intrinsic motivation as a kid than extrinsic. You got to develop that joy. All right, last thing before we get done here is what happened if you're in the yips, the choking, etc., or even in your life, you just feel stuck in this bad predictive rut and you can't, the short-term stuff doesn't do it, the long-term stuff doesn't do it. You got to shift your perspective to almost knock yourself out of the rut. Your brain is predictive. Sometimes you got to do something a little bit crazy to make it realign. I learned this from my high school coach, who every once in a while would give us what he called a see God workout, which meant on the track, the whole goal was to go see God, meaning to be so freaking exhausted that you almost think, okay, it's time to meet our maker. And if we ran slower, if we fell apart, if we didn't complete the workout, didn't matter. The goal was to see God. And these were rare, but they were perspective changers to let us realize that we are capable of more and that we can go into the depths of fatigue and be okay. We could risk failure, and the coach was happy, even if we fell short, because we put it all out there. And we need to do the same to our mind, not just physically, but sometimes psychologically. This is where I love the researcher Adam Alter's work, where he has told students to get over their fears to literally stand in an elevator backwards, facing the wall as other people come in and get on and get out, and just keep staring at the wall. Why? Because people are going to be like, what in the heck is wrong with this person? You're going to feel embarrassed, right? What are you doing? That embarrassment is the point. It shifts your perspective a little bit of like, hey, this might feel embarrassing, but at the end of the day, it's not life or death. It's going to be okay. I forget his name off the top of my head, but a famous acting coach used to have people do crazy things during acting class. They'd run around acting like an animal in front of their peers or audience when he gave them a keyword. And the point was to get them over their fear of looking silly. They were disrupting that rut. There's also research that shows that going off into the wilderness and on long hikes, they call it the 3-day effect, where by the third day, you've disrupted your sense of self and disrupted your world where you're free. You're not, trying to check your phone or feel that anxiety of trying to be productive every day and all the time and all that stuff. And by the third day, it shifts your perspective and you zoom way out and you're like, hey, that stuff's cool, but like I'm in nature and like maybe success isn't as narrow as I thought. There's all sorts of these things and I outline a ton in the book, but sometimes when we're stuck, we need to do something crazy that just nudges or pushes us out of that predictive rut to have our brain align or start creating a path somewhere else. All right. That's my not so brief outline of underperformance and choking at a very broad level. I could talk for hours about this. If you enjoyed it, if you found it useful, share it with others who need to hear these things, because it's not just in sport. It's a lot in sport, but it's also in life, in art, in our workplace where we find this. That's why in the book, I talk about from artists to entrepreneurs to physicians to actors to athletes on how to get our most out of ourselves, right? Actually a sculptor told me that like when he was stuck or feeling the pressure, he'd go outside and sprint up a hill near his studio because he would feel so exhausted and alive afterwards that it would often break him free from the pressure or the anxiety he was feeling when trying to sculpt. We can do all these things, and this is my deep exploration on how to do it. How to get out of survival mode and free yourself up to perform. So it's out now. Check it out. If you've already read it, thank you. Appreciate you. Share it with friends. What allows me to do these videos for free and spend time to go deep on these topics are my books. It supports everything else. So if you could support me with that, I'd be forever grateful. So with that, we'll leave you until next time. Keep performing. Subscribe if you like this. This is who I am, Steve Magnus. I just nerd out on the science and psychology of performance. None of the fancy stuff, just quality information.